So the subject this evening is an article in the Moment magazine, actually from spring of this year, so it's just came out, called "Ask the Rabbis: Does Jewish law require that hostages be redeemed regardless of cost?" So one important thing about this article, and it's been a while since I read it, so I don't remember all the details, is that they're addressing it from the perspective of Jewish law rather than politics and, you know, warfare and the rules of war and, you know, so that's important
You
to know.
mean Talmud when you say Jewish law, right?
I mean Jewish law, and Jewish law is formed in the Talmud and the codes and responsa, and I think some of the critical things are in Mishnah, but we'll see. But yeah, I mean, I don't remember if there are. I think there is a discussion of hostages in the Bible, but I could be wrong about that. So one of the things I thought I would just let us comment on is this whole question of, in particular what's happened in Israel, but it's not only Israel. So, we had that, and I don't remember, the names of everybody, but we had that female professional basketball player who was taken prisoner in Russia for having small amounts of marijuana, and she was traded for I think a Russian murderer that I think he was in prison even in Germany. So this happens all the time. Spies are exchanged. Um, I think the discussion in Jewish law is really talking about monetary cost. Namely, you take a hostage, and just like in kind of crime movies, you hold the hostage in exchange for a certain amount of money. So that's one way. And of course, what we see now in Israel, and it's a hugely controversial subject, is of course Hamas has taken, the most recent example of this is Hamas has taken, you know, many hostages, several hundred hostages, and in the various transactions which got many of them released, it was something like 9-1 or so, maybe more,
More.
of I'll just say Palestinians who were in Israeli prisons. I mean, we can go through, whether they were convicted or being held or whatever, but basically the deal was for roughly every live or for every Israeli hostage, and some of these were dead. Um, the Palestinians would see the release of 9 or 10 of their prisoners, and and Alan, you sent the podcast to me, but I've seen articles just going through the history in Israel of this, and it goes on over and over again. There was a guy named, and I'm sure it's going to be referred to in this article, Gilad Shavit, I think I might be saying
Shalit.
Sharit, right? Yes,
Shalit.
Shalit,
L-I-T.
right? Shalit, and he was exchanged for many, many hostages,
1200,
including, sorry,
approximately 1200.
approximately 1,200 Palestinian prisoners, including some who would go on to lead the Hamas raid in Israel.
Sinwar specifically.
Yeah. So that raises the question of whether you should be doing this. And as you'll see, Jewish law is actually going to address this because obviously one consequence of doing something like this is it encourages more people to take hostages. I mean, it's like when they asked the bank robber, "Why do you rob the bank?" He said, "Because that's where the money is." Why do you take hostages? Because it's effective, either in terms of money or just trading for people. So it really raises the question of of the of the wisdom and the legal uh, issues surrounding this kind of activity. So I don't know if anybody wants to make a comment before we dive into the article, but I'll give you an opportunity to. Yeah, Alan.
Just the counterpart is that to save a life is to save the world. So the tension is between
Yes.
going to the biblical or the Talmudic, I mean biblical, the
And
logic
then,
was financial, and it's a disincentive if in some ways if you give too much, they pay too much, but then the person's life is given up. So
right.
that's
And then the flip side of that, of course, is that with Shalit's um, exchange, he was exchanged for someone who went on to cause the death of thousands of Israelis. So it's not simple. And I think I even remember reading some, kind of pro-Palestinian argument saying that this was very insulting because we're saying that the lives of Israelis are worth 10 Palestinians. So it's kind of ironic. And
does
yeah.
this. I'm going to bring up a subject that you may cover in the article. I heard a podcast a few months ago on the subject of capital punishment
Hmm.
in the context of the hostages
Hmm.
or the prisoners. Israeli law forbids capital punishment, and Jewish law forbids it also, right?
No,
It does not forbid capital punishment.
no. In fact, capital punishment is the only mitzvah that's in every book of the Torah.
Okay, so going to Israeli law, the concept which is it will immediately be controversial whether it's in this article is that if the worst, since the terrorists are negotiating for the worst prisoners, the ones who've been
Hmm.
killed, murdered multiple dozens of times, if Israel invoked or created a capital punishment rule for multiple murders, some criteria, and got rid of the people instead of putting them in jail, they wouldn't be there to be negotiated with. Would it discourage terrorism? That was the thesis of
Yeah,
the.
yeah. I mean that's certainly an argument. I think in the among the people that the Israelis released, there were many people who were not even yet tried, but they
That's
were
right.
being held
Of course.
less.
It's really hard for me to say what I'm going to say, but I think it probably would need to be done. If someone takes a hostage, they should be able to get absolutely nothing for it. Because, like when we had these 5 hostages that we gave $6 billion to Iran, look at the weapons and everything else that came out of that and how many other people get murdered and killed and all these other things. If you had an ironclad law that if someone is a hostage, and I know if it was my wife or my child, I would want them returned. I know that.
Hmm.
But if you have maybe call them martyrs or whatever, but if people get taken and the people who take them can get absolutely nothing, I mean nothing, and eventually they would realize that taking hostages is fruitless, and we would probably save a lot more lives
Yeah,
than.
I think it's a reasonable argument. I, so yeah, Lois.
Yeah, I think I read the same article or piece that you did, Alan. But the issue I had with it assumes that the reason, maybe the only reason, that the Palestinians, the Gaza, the Hamas took hostages was to get their people out. And I think that's an assumption that we don't, I don't know that that's true. Uh,
Well,
I think terrorism is their motivator, not
killing
getting their people out.
killing Jews is a motivation, but if they didn't have this secondary goal of putting some use to the hostages, they would have kept killing people. They killed 1,100 people and cooked about 250 hostages. They could have killed more. They had a plan with a motive, and maybe we're not sure what the motive. Your question is, what was their motive?
Right.
But they're very big on claiming they want to kill all Jews. So that one's easy. So
Yes.
why? So
Right,
it's
which is supports what I'm saying. I'm not so sure that that is the motivation.
okay.
You're not so
That
sure the
it's,
motivation is killing
I'm
Jews
not,
or
no,
releasing
no,
people.
that their motivation is to get their people out of
Yes,
prison.
yes.
I
I
and that it's a big debate in Israel. I've read
Yeah,
it a
yeah.
couple of times.
But
Mhm.
I
it's like
just,
any ransom situation, if we can use that word, when people get abducted,
Mhm.
as civilians.
I thought they would trade them, frankly. I thought they'd trade them for safe passage, and they haven't done that either. So I think what they want them for is it's terrorism
There was a proposal when Senwar, before he was murdered, did include that. Passage to
Yeah, but
Yeah,
they turned it down.
I'll just observe that the hostages are almost the only card that Hamas holds now. They don't
Right.
have any military advantage. They're not going to do another sneak attack. Their ability to, send rockets and so on, I'm sure is greatly depleted. The only reason that Israel, even pauses in doing what they're doing, and they're not pausing much, is in the hope, is because I would say within Israel there is such over a overwhelming feeling, and Alan, you're closer to this than I am, that we should really, just cease hostilities and go back to the old system if we can get the hostages out.
Well, there's not just one viewpoint, but the thing I would add is there is a goal, could be a goal. Hamas wants they want to retain their political,
Right.
administrative,
Yes, their political power.
yeah, they want to stay in power and run Gaza, and so that's a powerful, a very valuable card, the hostages, and Israel has no interest in allowing that. America has no interest, but how you get from here to there is, of course,
Yep.
hard.
So it's a difficult situation, and when in doubt, let's see what the rabbi said 1,500 years ago, rather than worrying about it. So, let me share screen. Okay. Oops.
Since we know the answer to that is no, is that a very short article? Sorry.
No, it's not a short article at all.
I
Okay.
know.
So okay, so let's just go around, and rather than having Joanne read the entire thing, Joanne, I'll let you start.
Okay.
Yeah, okay. So it's first is independent, my friend Gershom Winkler.
All right. Jewish law should be reckoned in context rather than in blanket one-size-fits-all applications. While there is barely a mitzvah more urgent than the redemption of captives, the question of cost must be considered, not in funds, but in lives. The kidnapper's demand in the present case was not ransom money, but a pause in a war against thousands of sworn mass murderers and the release from imprisonment of hundreds more, all hell-bent on resuming their campaign of mass slaughter and rape against our people at the first opportunity. For every 3 or 4 hostages redeemed at this cost, how many dozens of innocents are we risking to be blown to pieces on a school bus one day or massacred at a concert? Israel abolished the death penalty decades ago. This was a huge mistake, for which we are now paying dearly. In the words of the 2nd century CE Rabbi Elazar, anyone who acts mercifully toward the cruel will in the end act with cruelty towards the merciful. But here we are. God help us.
And then just to underline it, in every book of the Torah, there is a mention that someone who takes a human life should forfeit their own life. And of course, there are lots of other sins which are punishable by capital punishment. In fact, I have an article on that. We'll get to it at some point. And violating the Sabbath is punishable by death. Adultery is punishable by death. There's a lot. So it's and as Gershom points out, and I think most of us know, in Israel, there is not capital punishment. I thought it was only Eichmann that the Israelis put to death, but there's actually one other person
Really?
that was put to death. Yeah, we'll get to it in the article.
Wow.
And I think later they found out that he was not guilty of what he was put to death for, if I'm not mistaken. So that is sort of interesting. Hey, would someone else like to read? These are quick things. So humanist.
Maimonides put it plainly, there is no mitzvah as great as the redemption of captives. This reflects a core Jewish value, pinyon shevyuchim, the obligation to redeem captives. Yet even as our tradition exalts this duty, many sages wrestled with the consequences of paying high ransoms, fearing it would invite further hostage-taking. How well do we understand this now as we watch our people come home, alive and dead, for the brutal price of releasing hundreds and thousands of terrorists? Some later halachists opposed such deals, warning they would endanger future generations. The case of Yechaya Sinwar, the architect of October 7th, haunts today's debate. He was among the 1,027 terrorists freed in 2011 in exchange for Gilad Shalit. And yet, despite these arguments, the Jewish people have made up their minds, expressed in yellow ribbons and anguished cries, to bring them home. In this we stand with Maimonides. He rooted his view in the Torah's decrees, do not harden your heart, and do not stand idly by the blood of your neighbor. Surely he knew the arguments against excessive ransom, yet his love for the Jewish people was too great. Like him, and despite all arguments, we refuse to harden our hearts or stand idly by the blood of our fellow Jews.
Okay, so that's Maimonides, and I mean, Alan, you're closer to this than I am. I presume that the overwhelming sense of public opinion in Israel is to make not any deal, but basically, I think if Hamas would say tomorrow, we will release all the hostages and return the bodies in exchange for a permanent ceasefire, that I don't know if Netanyahu and his government would agree, but I think that would attract the support of a majority of Israelis.
Your wording is true that the vast majority, 70% or more, would agree with your statement and would turn their head against worrying about Hamas staying in power, which is the condition that I'm going to say the government, which is the right wing, is adamant that Hamas can't, and even the logic of the beginning of your article, the logic is not to allow Hamas stay in power, and so the right wings like Smotrich say the hostages are not that important. Okay.
Yeah. Well, I mean, they probably wouldn't say it that way, but they would say the importance of getting rid of Hamas exceeds the value of these lives.
Yeah, exactly. So
that releasing those, basically settling the war, ending the war against Hamas, and releasing a lot of Palestinians would do more harm to Jewish lives and the Jewish people than would be attained by releasing what now is really only a couple of dozen living hostages.
They asked for 5 years, not a permanency. What Hamas asked for was 5 years of a ceasefire.
Okay, Dan.
They asked for it, or was that the latest negotiators? I mean, the independent.
Well, that's what they asked for. I think that while I agree with you, Alan, about the public sentiment in Israel that's different than the different agenda that the coalition has, and they're not of one mind either. One person wants to stay in the power and the other one wants to annex Gaza so they can also annex the West Bank. I think that's what's going on there. But there's an Israeli philosopher and academic named Micah Goodman. Has anybody?
Yeah. I know him. I know him personally. Yeah, right.
So his idea I thought was important, and he said, give it to them, but build into the agreement stuff that we know eventually they're going to break, and then you can go back in, but get those hostages out.
Exactly. And
Which I think is the reason why a lot of negotiations have fallen apart, even when people agreed to what Hamas was asking.
so
Because that
Hamas,
I think that's their only card at this stage.
to Lois's point about the 5 years, I read that one of the reasons that appeals to Hamas is I don't want to say they're afraid of Trump, but they realize Trump is not likely to be there in 5 years, and so they're willing to tie themselves up because they're assuming they can make more trouble with the next president that they're going to get now. Is
Okay, Les.
yeah.
There's an old expression, pay me now or pay me later. And a lot of times, if you pay now, it's so much less expense. I mean, Hamas wants maybe 5 years to rebuild, to rearm, and to be re-strengthened. And then they're going to come in, and God knows what they'll do again. So you need to eliminate them while you can, while you've got them on the run. Yes, we may lose some hostages. Yes, we may lose some more people. But 5 years from now, if they reconstitute and they become, what they were, we could lose thousands. So you've got to sit there and say, what is the cost now, and what will the cost be in the future?
I think it's a reasonable question, and it's a subject that I don't consider myself knowledgeable about. Whether it's even realistic to eliminate Hamas, because one of the results of this war is there is now, for the next 2 or 3 generations of Palestinians, even more hatred for Israel than there was before. So
But
they may not call themselves Hamas, they may call themselves something else, but
if you think of what happened with Afghanistan and we lost Bagram Airport, they had, from what I heard, millions of weapons and hundreds of millions, if not billions, of bullets and ammo and all that. And this fell into the hands of the Middle East. And
yeah,
who knows
okay.
that we're not paying the price because they're killing us
Okay,
with the
that really
Americans.
is a different subject.
No, I'm saying, but
yes.
yeah.
And a lot of countries have suffered trying to wrest Afghanistan from the Afghans. I mean, Russia did it, the United States did it. I mean, it reminds me of Vietnam. The French tried it, and the United States
No, I'm
tried
just
it.
saying when we abandoned the airport
Right. No,
there.
I understand that point.
And the
Okay.
other thing too is
Okay.
it was only about an hour away from China, and it was what I've heard was the deepest cement where anything could land there. It was an airport that was considered that you could land virtually anything.
Okay, let's stick to at least Israel and the subject.
Well,
So, Joanne, I want to give you a rest, and would someone else like to read Renewal?
I mean, if no one else wants to read, Rabbi, I'm okay. You
I
tell
will
me.
I will read one, and then I'll turn it back to you.
All right.
Renewal. As is common in halacha, we have a clear statement of Jewish law on this question, followed by centuries worth of circumventions. The Mishnah tells us that redeeming hostages is a great mitzvah, but communities must not pay more than the value of the hostage. Our rabbis worried about consequences. Paying excessive ransoms could drain the finances of Jewish communities and endanger their security by encouraging more kidnappings. Nevertheless, individuals were permitted to pay any amount for the release of their loved ones. So that's the difference between a community or government paying and an individual paying. Israel has faced agonizing hostage dilemmas in the past. As with our remaining hostages in Gaza, the issue is not financial, but political and strategic. Will the release of Palestinian prisoners lead to further violence against Israelis? Will a negotiated end to the war in Gaza in exchange for hostages endanger Israel's security if Hamas finds a way back to power? But there are costs to not redeeming the hostages too. Remaining in a state of war itself incites continuing attacks. Moreover, Israel's security depends on its people being willing to go to war to defend it. Abandoning the hostages would surely undermine Israel's basic trust in the government and the army. And I'll interject here, and again, Alan, you may be more on top of this than I am. There is, I know, a movement, I don't know how big it is, to ask reservists not to report for duty when they're called to in the continuation of this war, basically as a protest. I think it's certainly connected to the hostages, but I think it's also, it's obviously political But the idea is that, since Israel has resumed an aggressive, conduct of the war, there's a serious opposition in Israel to doing it. If
Yeah,
someone
so I
else,
would
yeah,
say there are discussions like that because reserve is optional. Actually, when you finish your fixed 3 years of duty, men for 2 years for women, then the reserve thing goes on until age 50 or 55. But the but it is optional, and that came up during the judicial over even before 2020, between October 7th, that there was a movement that was going to make its statement by not going into reserve, but it never got any far. Now it's different. It's very important. They're very shortage. They need a lot more soldiers. And if this small group becomes bigger, it could be a much bigger problem on the impact on the military.
yeah, and it is for those of us this far away from Israel, it's easy not to realize the effect on Israel of just all these people going into military service. And I worked for a couple of Israeli companies, and we would have senior executives who would just disappear for a month or two. And
Right.
this was during peacetime, uh, for their reserve status. And I'm talking about, guys in their 50s.
Small,
Um,
small
at,
businesses that have to shut down, restaurants and all those
yeah.
things. And
And
then you're
the
away from your
in this
family.
case,
Yeah.
after October 7th, almost every able-bodied Israeli citizen went to fight. And
Unless
so there was a,
you're 80,
sorry?
unless I,
Yeah, except for the ultra-Orthodox.
you can't
Um,
avoid, it's a
and,
big problem.
I know Sonia has relatives, cousins, who are French, but, one of the guys, one of her cousins was studying engineering in the Technion, and I guess he wasn't in a position to be in the army, but basically he went to work in a hotel. And he's actually a good cook, so he went to work as a cook in a hotel because the cooks, people were just off. People weren't around to pick crops. It was and is a serious
Which is,
issue
which is why even visitors, even my cousins who are citizens and retired, and people like me pick strawberries, pack
Mhm.
lentils, and et cetera, because there's a real impact on labor at all levels. Forget the, high tech side too. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, and just one more paragraph. Jewish thought has always distinguished between immediate mortal danger and potential risks. One is not required to forfeit one's life to save a person in peril, but if the risks are manageable and there is considerable safek sakana, doubt with regard to the dangers of rescue, one should attempt to redeem a person in danger. Perhaps through negotiation and statecraft, the cycles of escalatory violence can be diminished. Meanwhile, the lives of our specific hostages in Gaza hang unutterably in the balance, and that's renewal. I remember in the podcast you sent me, Alan, there was an interesting discussion about the difference between soldiers who are hostages and civilians who are hostages.
That's right. That's important.
And the underlying thought is that soldiers are in essence signing up for duty, contemplating the risk to their lives, whereas
That's
civilians, are in a different category.
But
And
the other condition of the soldiers, pardon me for interrupting you,
mhm,
is the contract from the military or the government is that no one is left behind. So
mhm.
there's this when you go to the civilian side, it's been a philosophy of Israeli society to go get civilians, but the
Mhm.
contract is much more spelled out for soldiers.
So it's very specific for members of
Yeah,
the
that
military.
you're obligated to risk your life and give up your life. That's clear, and the government will rescue you. They will never say we changed our mind or is we our priorities changed. With civilians, is a more complicated the way you've
Yeah,
alluded to.
I mean, these are very difficult questions. I'm going to read one more section and then we'll give it back to Joanne. How much is a human life worth? This is the Reconstructionist. How much is a human life worth? Jewishly, we can't calculate it and we shouldn't try. Every person is created in the divine image and is valuable beyond measure. Jews and our allies must bear that message loudly and proudly, even as our society makes cost-benefit analyses de rigueur and turns the cost of a human life into a political football. How much of your loved one's value is intrinsic and how much varies according to, say, lost earning potential? Is an urbanite worth more than a kibbutznik or a foreign worker? We should be aghast at such formulations, but they are commonplace. To express values, Judaism generally roots for rules, and roots meaning digs. Yet today, the study on which politicians rely literally undervalue future lives to justify more pollution or the risk of war here and now. For our beloved hostages now, we must do all we can, while yet aware of future risk to others when we reward terror. Most Israelis understand the conundrum, though the paths they advocate diverge. Just two clear rules. No cynical or self-serving motives in these life and death debates. And if we err toward pekuach nefesh, saving lives. Yeah, it's one of the interesting ironies of, I would say, religious thought is the idea that human life is infinitely valuable. And I'll just comment on a couple of, in my many careers, not all of you know about all my careers, but I actually ran a couple of medical groups in my past careers. And I would go to trade shows where new and improved medical technology is introduced. And the company I worked for, actually I ran, was selling a product to hospital operating rooms. And there's fantastic technology that go into hospital operating rooms. And one of the interesting things is that once you have a new brilliant technology and it works, it becomes malpractice not to use it without a lot of consideration as to what it costs. So because the underlying supposition is that the value of a human life is infinite. Yet,
I'm sorry.
sorry?
Is that an American practice?
Oh, yeah, I'm just talking about American practice. I think in other, it's actually an artifact of our healthcare system, which I don't necessarily think is the best in the world, but it is an aspect of it. And yet, you can spend money in other ways to save more lives at a much lower cost. I remember, I worked for an electric utility, which was a nuclear utility. It was, Northeast Utilities in Connecticut and Massachusetts. It was the most heavily nuclear utility in the country. And basically what would happen is every now and again, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission would come up with ways of making nuclear power plants safer. And so, the piping that was carrying radioactive water might be, I don't know, 10 or 12 inches thick of stainless steel. It's astoundingly expensive, astoundingly difficult to weld and to check the welds and everything. So in looking at how much money we were willing to spend to make nuclear energy a little bit more safer, you could calculate the value of saving a life by making nuclear power safer. And it was in the order of $1 billion per prospective life. And at that time, I think this was just not that long after seatbelts became mandatory. So you could calculate, and seatbelts, of course, have a cost, right? You put in seatbelts, they're not free, and we know that they save lives. And so the cost of saving a life with seatbelts, I remember, was the order of like $1,000 per life. And then, when I worked in the solar energy industry, they calculated the cost of saving lives in remote villages, that are not connected to an electrical grid, by putting a small photovoltaic array in a village, and that array can run a refrigerator that keeps medications cold, right? because some medications you have to keep cold. I mean, you remember COVID when it first came out, you had to be cryogenic. And that was like 25 cents per life. So that this whole concept of what is the value of a life is a fascinating one. And I think as you know, I can't remember if we have any lawyers here.
Mhm.
But when you have, when you're suing someone for wrongful death, I'm pretty sure in our legal system, the way you calculate the value that the person who caused the wrongful death should have to pay is in the earnings potential of is in no small part due to the earnings potential. So the causing someone to die, and someone like me, in late 70s, not such a big deal. I don't have that much less left to earn. But you take an MBA who just got out of Harvard, and he's got a tremendous amount to earn. And then of course there is pain and suffering, but it is. I mean, this whole subject of what is the value of a human life is a fascinating one. Les.
I forget who the doctor was associated with the administration maybe 10 years ago. Maybe someone will remember who it was. He said, when you reach 75 years of age, you shouldn't get any more medical care because you really aren't going to be around that much longer. Does anybody remember when that was said and
No,
who it was?
I don't remember it, but it's not important who. The important thing is, I would say, and I appreciate you raising it, is it equates the value of life with, in effect, how much useful things you can do for the remainder of your life. And that's very different from someone who's 75 to someone who is, who's 35. So it's another factor here. Okay, Joanne, I'm going to bump it back to you in reform.
Okay.
Oh,
Reform. The continuing tragedy of the hostages in Gaza raises one of the hardest ethical dilemmas generations of Jewish scholars have been forced to answer. The Jewish textual debate is an ethical one rather than legal or theological. Utilitarian approaches to ethics found in Jewish texts suggest that captives should be redeemed, but not at a cost that exceeds their value, since that could put a financial burden on a family or community. Alternatively, a common good approach also found in the text asserts that captives should not be redeemed if doing so enables additional kidnappings, thus putting other people at risk. Finally, a care-based approach to ethics is also evident. Captives should be redeemed no matter the cost to comfort grieving families and end captive suffering. Is there a right answer to this question? No. Each ethical lens suggests a different vision of how an ethical community would behave. But as a rabbi, I pray that as you read these words, more families will have been reunited with their loved ones.
Alan, you have your hand up.
and if I can just go back, two things. In your nuclear energy company, where they were trading off lives for the costs of the construction, was the environment tried to evaluate it also in
Well,
those?
what I was talking about is a specific issue when the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is ruling on basically what equipment should be used in building a nuclear power plant. And so, you select equipment that's in theory very safe, but very expensive. So that implies that you're willing to pay a very large amount of money to improve the safety of nuclear power. And I remember the scholar that delivered this talk even talked about the difference between saving between looking at the potential for an accident that could have widespread application versus accidents that people don't feel like they personally are in danger of. And what he meant is everybody's afraid of nuclear power. I mean, people generally are afraid of nuclear power. They're afraid of nuclear accidents. They're afraid of nuclear meltdowns, and so on. So that fear is real, and it basically resulted in the elimination of nuclear power as a realistic alternative these days. I mean, it may change in the future. People aren't so afraid of dying in car accidents, even though it's much more likely. People feel like because they're driving, they have less, of a chance. So not everybody, is afraid, wants to see mandates to spend a lot more money to improve safety in automobiles. I mean, you remember the helmet laws. I'm sure helmets save a lot of lives and keep people from horrible traumatic injuries. But a lot of motorcyclists said, I'm a good motorcycle rider. I'm not afraid of dying. So anyway, so there was a whole discussion. It's basically a discussion, which the interesting part for me is, how does society evaluate and respond to the value of a human life? And that was a whole discussion there. And as I say, and then there's also another element which I find interesting, is that a specific life has a huge value. So you had these two astronauts stranded on the space station.
Mm.
How much money are they going to spend to bring those guys home? Or, a couple of cases where we're all here old enough to remember these cases. Some poor kid falls into a well, and they spend, enormous amounts of money to save this one kid's life. Or the soccer team was in the cave, you remember, in Thailand a couple of years ago. So when it's a specific life, people will, I mean, society, our human response is to spend a lot more money than trying to electrify, the jungle, to improve healthcare in the jungle. Less.
Looking back, say at Hitler, back in say 1930, how would Judaism look at someone who murders him? Would that be, in Judaism, would that be a good thing, a bad thing, immoral? What would it be?
I would say it would be moral, if you had
The foresight to know what.
the base on the idea. There's basically a law, and I think I talk about this many times in the Talmud, where if you know that someone is getting up at 8 o'clock in the morning to murder you or murder others, you get up at 7 o'clock and kill them before they murder. And your killing them is not murder, it's a justified killing. So a preemptive taking of life is not considered murder to save other lives.
But how would you be 100% positive?
Well, that's another question.
Yeah,
that is a case by case question. And the realistic one is, think about the 6-Day War. In the 6-Day War, Israel could see that the armies of the Arab countries surrounding Israel were massing tanks and airplanes and getting ready to attack. And Israel attacked them before they could start the attack. So it was a preemptive strike. Israel struck first. And under Jewish law, that is considered kosher. Stephen.
The reason people fear some things more than car accidents, it's not that they think they're a good driver and that the danger is less. That was once believed, but they did a study where they found that even if you restrict your sample to people who are aware that and know that they're more likely to die in a car accident than some other cause, they still fear driving more. I think they compared it to plane crashes. And apparently what it is even though even if the person knows that they cannot drive so safely as to make driving safer than flying, the fact that they have some influence over it,
yes,
makes them feel safer about it than something where the danger they know to be less, but is completely outside of their control.
Right. So it's why we would spend $1 billion making nuclear plants safer, but there's an argument about whether spending a few $1,000s to make cars safer, based on the prospective life. So I think I'll read the next one, conservative, and we're getting close. Okay. As with so many challenging questions, it is easy to find rabbinic sources that conflict. The Talmud calls pidyon shevuim, redemption of hostages, a great mitzvah, and says that that captivity is worse than starvation and death. Similarly, in the Mishnah Torah, Maimonides writes, the redemption of captives held for a ransom takes precedent over sustaining and clothing the poor. You do not find a greater mitzvah than the redemption of captives. There is one major exception, as explained in the Mishnah, not to be confused with the Mishnah Torah. They are about 800 years apart. One does not ransom captives for more than their value because of tikkun olam. The Talmud offers two explanations. First, the rabbis feared the financial burden to the community. Second, they were afraid that high ransom for captives would encourage kidnappers to kidnap more Jews and demand still higher ransoms. We know from the Talmud, the commentaries, the Cairo Geniza, and responsive literature that there were many exceptions to the rule. Do we bring the hostages home from Gaza? On one hand, the Jewish people will not be able to move past October 7th until all 251 hostages are back home. On the other hand, the deal includes releasing terrorists with blood on their hands, endangers Israelis, and encourages further violence and kidnapping. Jewish tradition affirms both answers, a modern-day version of Sophie's Choice. When dealing with the brutality and barbarity of Islamic extremisms, there are no good choices. Okay, I don't know if we'll finish. Probably not, but we can do a little bit next week. Joanne, you want to continue with modern Orthodox?
Okay. On the one hand, the tradition is that redemption of captives is the highest priority ahead of community needs such as Torah learning, synagogue, holiday needs, or tzedakah. On the other hand, the Talmud says that one should not pay an excessive ransom for captives, lest it encourage more captive taking. In the famous case of Rabbi Meir of Rothenburg, the rabbinic great of his time and place, the community was ready to pay any amount to free him. Rabbi Meir felt, however, that his captor was demanding an outrageous ransom. He instructed his community not to redeem him. He remained in captivity until he died. In the end, for our hostages, it is a judgment call. The decision cannot be based on some written or traditional rule. The living generation has the authority and capacity to weigh each factor, including the value of human life. The IDF principle of solidarity and its effect on morale, the price demanded, and the likelihood of repeat killing and hostage taking if the demands are met. I personally believe that, since every human being is of infinite value, Israel should pay the extortionate and dangerous price,
I'm gonna move it
including
up
pledging,
right
wait,
there.
Okay,
Yep.
including pledging a permanent ceasefire that likely keeps Hamas in power. I count on Israel, having learned the lessons of October 7th, not to allow another miscalculation of Hamas's intentions, not to permit reconstruction of Gaza unless Hamas is removed from power. So the post-redemption cost will not be that high.
Okay. Interesting. It's Greenberg. Orthodox. The easy answer, I'll read one
Sorry.
and then you can read the next one.
Yeah, all right.
The easy answer seems to be, of course not. Most people correctly cite the Mishnah Gittin that you don't redeem captives, at more than their value, and the Gemara's explanation that this could burden the community or stimulate captive takers to up the ante. But they should remember that this refers to a different kind of hostage taking from the one we're dealing with. Historically, hostage taking was a way to make money quickly without much effort. But war, halachically, is treated as a time when the human primacy of the preservation of life, both for the enemy and for combatants, is set aside. Otherwise, people could never be commanded to go to war. War is dangerous. You could get killed. But in a mitzvah war, everyone is commanded to participate, not just soldiers at the front. I think we've discussed this in the past. There are two kinds of war in rabbinic thought. One is milchemet reshut, a permitted war which is a war of conquest. And while in theory it's it's permitted because they couldn't say what King David did was wrong. They apply so many caveats to it, like not fighting on the Sabbath and so on, that kind of war can't practically be fought. But a milchemet mitzvah, which they talk about a mitzvah war here in this this article, is a war that is actually commanded, and that's a war basically of self-defense. In 1970, a terrorist group hijacked 4 planes and was holding hostages on the ground and negotiating. Among the hostages was Yitzhak Hutner, at the time one of the most important rabbis in the world. A separate negotiation for him was proposed for a huge amount of money, and the question of whether it was permissible went to Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky, an important ultra-Orthodox decisor and Hutner's friend. Kamenetsky said, no, you can redeem a Torah scholar for more than the usual value, but not in a time of war. The hostages were eventually freed, but the incident illustrates the idea that in wartime, you don't redeem captives if it means aiding and abetting the enemy in the midst of battle. I think we can probably finish. We'll go over a little bit. Joanne?
Sephardic. Applying the traditional sources to the current situation is a bit complicated. The Mishnah speaks about kidnapping for ransom, while we deal with murderers who have political demands. The Mishnah sees criminals possibly kidnapping more people and asking for higher ransom, while we deal with a price that might bring murder and destruction and put a whole country in existential danger. Another view might be that after so long with hostages in captivity in horrific conditions, no price is too high. Judaic sources can offer general guidelines, but the specific decisions during negotiations should be in the hands of professionals. My personal view is that the whole world has been held captive by terrorists for more than 50 years now, and we are all paying a very high price. Terrorists around the world copycat one another to achieve their goals and wreak havoc on individuals and governments. World governments should unite in their efforts to eradicate terrorism, kidnappings, and human trafficking through military force, advanced intelligence, and full financial transparency.
And Chabad, I don't know if that's the last one. Yes, okay, good. The Jerusalem Talmud says, one who saves a life is as though he saved the entire world. The Babylonian Talmud teaches that redeeming captives is one of the greatest mitzvot, since captivity is worse than death. This value runs from the dawn of Jewish history to the present day. Abraham risked his life to save Lot from captivity, and the ethic remained a hallmark of the Hasidic master's activity. Maimonides and the Shulchan Aruch codify this point in Jewish law. Although the Mishnah presents a seemingly contradictory teaching, we may not redeem captives beyond their appropriate ransom due to tikkun olam, repairing the world. Since the first Jibril agreement in 1985, Israel has freed hundreds or thousands of terrorists for a few hostages. While every life is of infinite value, a tragic result is that the hostage-taking has become a core tactic of terrorist strategy against Israel. What then can be done? In the Lubavitcher Rebbe's view, the dynamics of hostage exchange in contemporary Israel are more problematic than the cases in which the halakha exhorts against redeeming hostages. Not only do such exchanges encourage future kidnappings, they also eviscerate prison's deterrent effect, as murderers know they will only remain in prison until the next hostage exchange cycle. Moreover, the released terrorists go on to commit further acts of terror, killing more Israelis. The Rebbe taught that Israel must not allow itself to be held hostage to a paradigm that empowers terrorists.
Yeah.
Instead, it should reorient its security policy toward credible deterrence and proactive defense to eliminate the hostage-taking threat. While the Jewish people value mercy and peace, our enemies cynically exploit these virtues. Our tradition warns that short-sighted kindness can lead to disastrous consequences. Rather than repeating the cycle of capture and release, we must break the current paradigm and form a new path guided by Torah's explicit view of Tikkun Olam. And I'm going to stop sharing. I want to make one other comment, and that is one of the things that has long struck me about Israel and Jewish law is basically Jewish law was crafted by the rabbis in a time of Jewish powerlessness. The Mishnah and the Talmud are all created during a time, and even, Maimonides, basically, Jews have no control over a nation from the year 70 until the year 1948. That's a long time.
Wow.
And so the values that we espouse in Jewish law, in a way, are easy to espouse because we're not responsible for implementing them. And now we're in a world where, on one hand, we want Israel to be a light to the nation, light to the nations, plural, to be an example of higher ethics. But on the other hand, we sort of don't like the idea that Israel is held to a double standard, and that it really shouldn't be held to a standard higher or more difficult than other nations. I remember vividly feeling this when I'm sure this was in Jerusalem, seeing a bunch of now they all look like soldiers to me because the police are dressed like soldiers. And the policemen were hassling a bunch of young Arab kids. And I have no idea what the issue was. I mean, there was, a mixture of Arabic and Hebrew, so I don't have a clue. And, no weapons were fired. I don't think anybody was arrested. But I remember thinking, it's really hard to be, on one hand, espousing the idea that every human life is sacred and everyone ought to be treated as though they're created in the image of God, and knowing, on the other hand, that if you don't take actions like this, people are blowing up buses. And I remember vividly, I think it was time when I was doing business in Israel, on Purim, blowing up basically a department store where kids were, the equivalent of trick-or-treating in costumes and celebrating Purim. So it's tough to espouse Jewish values and also be responsible for running a country and having the lives of Israelis dependent on you. Alan.
Yes. So I think your point about powerlessness in the history is very, very relevant to a lot of things that I, hear and read. However, I would go to the part, or at least I'm using some of my Hartman teaching, learning, is this not a double standard? Actually, it's taking advantage of the power when you're not powerless. And that's a new experience because it's only been 77 years, and that's not very long, that Israel is trying to figure out how to use power in a Jewish values way. And our critics do things which make us feel like we're held to another standard. But I'm just talking about Israel as a society. Actually,
and Israeli law doesn't always follow Jewish law.
That's right. I have another subject. I'm sorry, when I finish that.
Okay. No, because again, capital punishment is outlawed in Israeli law, and it is certainly part of Jewish law.
That's right.
As one example. Yeah, go ahead.
The movements. Okay, as you took us through conservative reform, Reconstruction, Chabad, I didn't eat and tell me where I might have missed this. They all, each of their presentations made sense, but they didn't come out as being based on their movement in a way that they're being categorized. Did you feel like the Orthodox were saying things different than Laura Weiner was saying?
No, it's actually that's a very interesting point, and I'm glad you pointed it out. And on one level, the definition I give, which is my definition of what Reform Judaism is, it isn't official by any standard, is that ethical laws are binding on Jews, ethical Jewish laws are binding, but ritual laws, do you keep strictly kosher, do you pray 3 times a day, and so on, are between you and God. And here we're clearly just talking about ethical rules. So I don't see a big difference
Yeah, I mean, each speaker has its own spin, but it's not like I thought, oh, I disagree with this because I'm Reform and this
Yeah,
person is Chabad. I
yeah.
can do that. I mean, I'm in discussions where I've done that. This
Hmm.
is to apply, yeah, in this
Yeah,
case.
yeah. And the other thing is, none of these speakers really have a clear decision for what to do. I mean, I don't know if yeah, I presume, but I'm not certain that the religious parties in Israel tend to be more right wing. Um, but we have a reform rabbi who is a member of the Knesset. I'm guessing he's more left wing. I don't actually follow.
Gilad Karif, of course.
Yes,
Yeah,
yeah.
of course he is. Yeah.
So it is interesting because this one there's no good answer. We'll wait for the Messiah to come and ask him what to do.
But Lois's point, I think, of I'm thinking of about the fact that it's the pressure to actually free the hostages. Uh, don't worry about Hamas staying in power. Just get that kind of. It ends up being political more than as much as anything, I
Yeah,
suppose.
and there's a whole element of the current government trying to stay in power, and governments try and do that. Uh, People like their jobs, and people in power generally like holding on to power. Um, so that enters into it. Okay, so thank you all. I want to actually, I'm going to stop the recording. Whoops. Yeah.